Okay,
Yeah.
Bismillah. I think I'll start off with setting the scene for the discussion. The year 1975 saw the establishment of probably the first darul in the UK. And now currently we are in 2021, so that's about 46 years. According to the UMSEP report, 2021 report, there are about 46 traditional seminaries in the UK. These institutions, according to the same report, produce around 400 graduates every year. I'm one of these graduates. During my A-levels, I developed a very keen interest in exploring Islam, the Islamic sciences at a much deeper level. As a young person in Britain at that time, I had two main options. I could either go through the Madrasah route or the university route. I opted for the Madrasah as this option seemed more focused on the sciences and was considerably cheaper. Whilst the admission process seems simple enough for these institutions, for the average Muslim wanting to undertake an Islamic education, it poses many challenges for those of us who are not average. Those who are often described as complicated or special cases, in other words, Muslims with disabilities. So as a Muslim with a visual impairment, this presentation is a reflection on not only my journey through the Madrasah system, but also as a researcher exploring the experiences of Muslims with disabilities at an academic level. So for Muslims in Britain, generally speaking, there are usually four main avenues of gaining religious education. We have the home, the mosques, the madaris, or the modern academy. In this presentation, I will be focusing on the mosques and the madaris in a bit more depth. So while the darulooms and mosques have attracted much political, social, and academic interest, the conversation does not seem to even mention, let alone interact with people with disabilities. Therefore, there's not much research to draw on, especially when it comes to British Muslims with visual impairments. As part of my research, I conducted a pilot study exploring the experiences of Muslims with visual impairments and the attitudes of the wider Muslim community towards legal. So this table presents the results of a particular question from the pilot study. The question asked the interviewees to reflect on how having a visual impairment has impacted their life in terms of access to religious education. The study involved 8 participants. 75% of the participants in some capacity while they were young in order to gain religious education. Out of the ones that did attend, half were unable to read the Quran until adulthood. They all attributed this to the lack of the provision of accessible materials by the mosque. Speaking of accessible materials, only 2 of the participants that were interviewed had access to enlarged texts. However, they were either provided to them by the parents or the school. Only 2 of the participants learned how to read the Quran in Braille at a younger age.
I think if we can just give sort of the sound, there may have been some sound
right.
problem.
So out of the 2 participants that did learn how to read the Quran at a younger age in Braille, one had learned it because he was enrolled into an international Islamic school for blind children. And the other one had learned it in school in the UK. However, it's noteworthy that the only participant that learned how to read Braille Quran in the UK was also the only participant that did not attend mosques for learning purposes. An interesting point raised by the participants who were unable to read any text due to sight loss was the expectation of memorization. They expressed that while they attended mosque, they were expected to learn everything by heart via the oral tradition. This not only made these individuals feel inferior, but it placed undue pressure and unrealistic expectations on them. As for Muslims with vision impairments attending darulooms, I haven't been able to find any participants. So this is where I shall be drawing on my own lived experience. So the madrasa I opted for was an obvious choice, as there was already an established madrasa for girls in the city that I was living in. The application process was fairly simple. You have an application form, and then you have an in-person test and an interview. So the first step, the application form, was fairly simple, as I had the appropriate tools to do this part by myself. The second step, the in-person test, should have been simple enough, as at the time my only request was for the exam paper to be provided in an enlarged format. However, this was difficult to communicate because, as the madrasa in question had never dealt with a student with a visual impairment, they weren't exactly sure what it meant to have an enlarged format. And for myself, as someone who was very much used to communicating my accessibility needs, even through the mainstream education system, this seemed normal enough for me. However, for most people, this would have been very off-putting. After successfully completing the test, I was faced with step number 3, which was the interview. Whilst most of the other participants answered simple questions and read out passages from the Quran, I had to deal with explaining why I needed a magnifying aid in order to, access the mushaf, or making my case for the allowance of the use of an iPad in the classroom. As I rely on digital formats for accessing information, an iPad is the most important accessibility tool for me. I was fortunate enough that whilst a potential student with a vision impairment was very unfamiliar territory for the institute, they were very open to having me, as long as I could make the necessary accommodations to make the material accessible for myself. So after lengthy conversations and the signing of a physical contract, I was allowed to bring in my own iPad into the classroom on the condition that no other student would have access to it. I also think this was a little bit easier for me because I was not going to be boarding at the school. I also had to buy the same set of books each semester like the rest of my peers. I would then post these books to a printing facility in London, and they would scan the books and send me back PDF versions at a cost. I would then be able to access these using the iPad in the classroom. In British schools and colleges, generally speaking, students with vision impairments are given an extra time allowance for examinations, and this is usually 25%. This allowance was also made available to me in the madrasa. However, I had to pay for the extended time that the examination invigilator would have to stay for this extra time allocation. After only a couple of weeks at the institute, a teacher held a meeting with my mother to advise her that I be taken out of the institute, as it would be far too challenging for someone special like her daughter. My mother requested that I be allowed to stay till the end of the semester so I can take the exams, and then we can make any decisions afterwards. I finished in the top 3 of the class, and no concerns were raised in regards to my special status afterwards, because I've maintained my top 3 position for the rest of the time at my institute. I graduated in 2016 and moved on to pursuing Islamic studies at a higher education level. From this experience and the experiences of the participants in the pilot study, a few challenges can be highlighted. First of all, institutions, mosques or madaris, do not yet seem to be equipped with the tools to provide a basic religious education to children or adults with vision impairments. Secondly, there also seems to be a great lack of accessible Islamic texts for Muslims with vision impairments, especially in braille. And thirdly, attitudes towards and perceptions of Muslims with vision impairments as them being incapable or abnormal or special or complicated further put barriers in their path to accessing religious education. In the same pilot study, questionnaires were also conducted within the Muslim communities in order to explore their attitudes towards Muslims with visual impairments. And I received about 74 responses. So question 11 asked the respondents whether or not a person with a visual impairment would excel in their occupation. So while 62% of the participants answered in the affirmative, 19 said no, and another 19 said maybe. I think it's interesting to note that the people that said no or maybe, their occupations included social workers, students, and teachers. And it should be noted that the participants that were interviewed for this study included 2 social workers, a teacher, and 1 student. And 4 of the participants had already gone to university, with 1 starting soon. So this disparity in the actual achievements of people with visual impairments and how they're viewed by the wider community further solidifies this notion of their perceived incapability. This not only isolates such individuals from religious institutes, religious gatherings and institutes, but also places many obstacles in their path of gaining religious education. This isolating experience also transcends into social interactions of Muslims with visual impairments with the wider community. This could also explain the lack of Muslims with disabilities being in a position of researching Islam, Muslims, and disabilities at an academic level. There are obviously many possible solutions. However, before mentioning a couple of those, I think it should be noted that it's not that these institutes are unwilling to help. It's just that they don't know how to help. Because developing solutions is a process. And the first step in that solution is always acknowledging the existence of an issue or a challenge that needs to be resolved. So in regard to possible solutions, I suppose, the first one that is proposed, slides are not working. So the first one is educating the educators in regard to the challenges posed by a visual impairment, with a focus on not just building more accepting attitudes, but also an inclusive environment for the learning and teaching of Islam. At the same time, highlighting achievements of people with visual impairments in order to dispel the stereotypes of them being incapable or abnormal. However, none of this can truly be successful without the involvement of Muslims with disabilities. So Muslims have been part of the British demographic for centuries. Whilst this group has attracted much attention within the academic domains, there is much research that is about them rather than for them. My doctoral research aims to generate research for the Muslim communities in Britain in a relatively neglected area, which is Muslims and disabilities. The focus of the study is on sensory disabilities, in particular visual impairments. The research study aims to create a narrative into which the experiences, views, and challenges of British Muslims with visual impairments are woven with an insight into the attitudes held by the wider Muslim communities towards such impairments and disabilities. So according to Tom Shakespeare, there are 2 main strands of disability studies in terms of social research. One focuses on the understanding the experiences and views of people with disabilities, while the other focuses on the exploration of the responses of the wider society to such disabilities and impairments. My research primarily focuses on the former one, which is developing an understanding of the challenges faced by Muslims with vision impairments, with the latter one appearing in the secondary objectives of the research, which is developing an understanding of the attitudes towards people with vision impairments within the British Muslim communities. Therefore, the research objectives of the study are as follows. Firstly, to identify the challenges faced by British Muslims with vision impairments via an exploration of their lived experiences. And secondly, to identify the attitudes towards Muslims with vision impairments held by the wider Muslim communities. The hope is that the research will result in a significant impact on several levels. So firstly, on a community level, to not only give voice to Muslims with vision impairments to express and explore their experiences and raise awareness of the challenges associated with having a disability and its impact on the self, but also to encourage an open dialogue on the topic of disabilities within the Muslim communities. Secondly, on a much broader level, to provide a foundation for the development of support services that are better suited to Muslims with disabilities. On an academic level, it will not only fill existing gaps in the research, but also provide areas for further research. So, for example, working on developing an Islamic liberatory theology of disabilities, or exploring the provision or the availability of accessible religious education to Muslims. We could also look at a pastoral care response to disabilities that is grounded within the Islamic theology. I think it would be very interesting to also explore what is the driving force of the formation of these attitudes, whether it's cultural factors or religious ideologies, etc., etc. And I think I will close my presentation on that. And thank you for your time.